This is the Sunday stream opening song because the other song is copyrighted. La 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 la. Oh look, here comes Dog Cat Fox.
Hi, Sky.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday stream. The stream I do on Sundays, because Sunday is the day to stream on Sundays. Hope you're all doing well this beautiful Sunday morning. I thought I'd do something different today because yesterday I was off and running visiting my family for my mother's birthday. We had a lovely time together, hanging out, chatting, having some yummy food. And as a consequence of that and some other things, I got distracted and didn't quite have an idea of what I'd do today. And then this morning, early this morning, the crack of dawn, I was like, aha, I'll try something different. And so here we are. But I'll talk about that momentarily. First, who's joining me this morning for this perhaps informational, perhaps discussatory, perhaps abstract Sunday stream? I don't know. Dax to the max. Good morning. Noah Asensio, good morning. TC, good morning. Dr. Funkenstein's Ghost, good morning. Who else is here? Keeverdam, good morning. Also, Keeverdam providing me, as always, with the links to the fundraisers for our friends Moonshock and Angry Illinoisian. They are now pinned to the top of the chat box. If you guys could take a moment to look at those when you have a chance. If you can donate, it would be absolutely appreciated. If you can share the links, if not otherwise, that would also be appreciated. So thank you so much. Resolute Germ, good morning. Let's see, did I already say TC? I'll say TC again. Good morning. Mike Savage, good morning. Adiga Outlaw. Adiga? Adiga. Brittany Holland, good morning. Ryan R, good morning. Arc210, good morning. Somnamnum Nation, good morning. Shadowclaw, good morning. Pip Bin, good morning. Seftus Wolf, good morning. Gulf City, DCC 182, good morning. Lexi Mads, good morning. And if I missed you, if you're lurking, if you're in the future, good morning. So I was thinking this morning about some complaints that I and many other people have had in recent times about certain franchises, certain fictional worlds, certain characters that we all have a certain amount of love for in our own ways, and how some outlets, whether it's the comic book companies that originated them or the Hollywood studios that are now in charge of them, have been treating these things. And I got to thinking about consistency. Consistency. Or at least being able to know where you are in a particular narrative with a particular character. And I recalled there's a nice little essay that kind of sets that up about world building, about establishing the rules of the road for the sandbox that these little adventure stories are taking place in, and what an absolute necessity in my mind it is to have a Bible for the world you're working within. And also, I'll expand on that as I go. But this, I wanted to read an excerpt from an essay written by Robert E. Howard. This is the guy who created Conan the Barbarian, as we know him today. And he was one of a very few writers of his day who actually took the time to establish the rules with which he would operate under in telling his stories before telling them. Similar, and I would bring up J.R.R. Tolkien in detail. The problem is, I am not a J.R.R. Tolkien nerd. Okay, there are people out there who are far, far more knowledgeable on that subject and his works, and I would be doing it no service by trying to describe it myself. Safe to say, the guy created an entire world, geography, metallurgy, languages, cultures, the whole nine yards. And that's basically what those books are about, and all of the appendices and so on. And so I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but when someone is a J.R.R. Tolkien nerd or a Middle Earth nerd, there is a common language, not a literal language, but a common language of discussion and familiarity and kinship that occurs, because when you talk about something in the J.R.R. Tolkien universe to someone else who's familiar with it, there's a lot that doesn't need to be said, and there's a lot that you already know as a shared experience. That is the value of world building when it comes to things like this, because then there's a common language amongst fans and nerds. So let me read a little bit from this essay. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Link to it is in the description if you're interested in yourself, and it is interesting stuff. Because the Conan the Barbarian, it's sort of a blessing and a curse of the Arnold Schwarzenegger series, in that they're very popular movies, but they also portray Conan and his world in kind of a, oftentimes kind of meat-headed, kind of simple way. That's not the case about the original material. So let me read a little bit about this. This is by Robert E. Howard from 1936. Nothing in this article is to be considered as an attempt to advance any theory in opposition to accepted history. It is simply a fictional background for a series of fiction stories. When I began writing the Conan stories a few years ago, I prepared this history of his age and the peoples of that age in order to lend him and his sagas a greater aspect of realness. And I found that by adhering to the facts and spirit of that history in writing the stories, it was easier to visualize, and therefore to present, him as a real flesh and blood character rather than a ready-made product. In writing about him and his adventures in the various kingdoms of his age, I have never violated the facts or spirit of the history here set down, but have followed the lines of that history as closely as the writer of actual historical fiction follows the lines of actual history. I have used this history as a guide in all the stories in this series that I have written. Okay. That simple, passage there really tells you what you need to know and what is so valuable about pre-establishing the rules of your universe before you start writing stories. That's not to say that you can be a writer and you're not allowed to just tell a story, right? But once you start setting down the rules of the road, it's important to stick to them. One example I want to give, I tried to find an image of this somewhere, but I couldn't find it. And I brought up this example before. It comes from one of the older Doctor Strange comic books. I wish I could cite for you the issue number and so on so you could find it yourself. At some point, I'll have to look back in my collection of paperback collections and see if I can find it. But it was this storyline where Doctor Strange had to get a job. A real job. Okay, I'll talk about that in a second. But first, thank you, Derek LaRue, as always. If I can bring this up here. Thank you again, as always, for your continued support. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Very generous of you. Also, a couple more hellos as I'm seeing people here. Lurking Gopher, good morning. Random American, good morning. Who else is here? Kay Scholl, good morning. Evil Clipazine, good morning. So there was this storyline where Doctor Strange comes back from fighting off some threat to the multiverse, to the dimension of Earth. And he comes back to the Sanctum Sanctorum. And his assistant, Wong, comes up to him and says, Master, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, Master, I hope everything is well. And Doctor Strange is like, yes, I've defeated Dormammu for the 17th time. Everything is well. Earth is protected once again. And Wong is like, Master, I hate to bring this up, but rent is coming due, and you don't make any money doing what you do. And Doctor Strange is like, what? And so for the next issue or two or something, at least for a full issue, Doctor Strange has to bring himself back down to Earth, literally, to try to deal with the most mundane and yet important things in the world, that is, earning a living. And so there's this weird, comedic, but also very relatable and human series of events where Doctor Strange is trying to find a job. Because as you may or may not know about Doctor Strange, he used to be an actual, neurosurgeon. They never really made it that specific in his origin story, but eventually they kind of made him like a neurosurgeon, super surgeon. But his hands were destroyed as far as being functional for such detailed work in a car crash. And so he can't work as a doctor anymore. So he starts making phone calls to people he used to know and saying, hey, maybe I could consult on something, or hey, do you need a stage magician? It's really kind of comedic, but it's also, again, very humanizing of this character. And so, yeah, the storyline goes on where Doctor Strange has to find a job. But between the issue where this occurs and either the next issue or 2 issues down the road, the person in charge of writing the stories for Doctor Strange changes. And so the opening of this next comic book in the series has a scene where it's almost an exact copy of the previous scene in the previous issue, where Wong comes up to Doctor Strange and says, Master, our rent issues are still not resolved. We still need money. And Doctor Strange says, and I don't think I'm too far off in quoting this, he says, bah, of what concern is money to Doctor Strange? And he snaps his fingers, and a literal cauldron of gold, like at the end of a rainbow, suddenly appears in front of him and Wong's like, oh, Master, that solves all of our problems. And we move on. The writer of the next, person in charge of writing the stories didn't want to deal with Doctor Strange having to get a real job, so he just solved it with magic. I go through that example because that is one of the most blatant, there is no rules to abide by examples that I can come up with. And it ruins things. You had a moment to show that there's a limitation to what Doctor Strange can do. He has a weakness. Not necessarily something that an enemy could use against him, but an actual relatable weakness. There is a limit to his powers. And then the next guy comes along and lets us know there is no limit to his powers. He can just manifest money into existence without having to work for it. All right. At that point, there's no reason to keep following the storyline because everything can be solved with magic. Magic is one of those things introduced into a story or into a setting you have to be very, very careful about. Because if you do not set down very stringent rules of what it can or cannot do, then it can do anything. And it becomes a deus ex machina, and it can solve any problem without there having to be any, reality to it. That's why setting down your universe ahead of time, if you're going to be doing something epic, or even just starting out with something small, where is your story set? How does it work? How does it function? What are the rules of the road? Now, Howard, like J.R.R. Tolkien, set down the rules of their universe in concrete, basically, right? As Howard said in this essay here, he has never violated the fact or spirit of the history here set down. Now, he leaves himself a little bit of room in that spirit thing, right? But the rules are set in the history and the facts of the cultures in the world that he's creating here. I'll read a little bit of the beginning of this essay. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I got some other examples I want to go over. Continuing on with Robert E. Howard and the Hyborian Age. Of that epoch, known by the Numidian chroniclers as the pre-cataclysmic age, little is known except the latter part, and that is veiled in the mists of legendary. Known history begins with the warning of the pre-cataclysmic civilization, dominated by the kingdoms of Camelia, Pelusia, Verulia, Grondar, Thule, and Camoria. These people spoke a similar language, arguing a common origin. There were other kingdoms, equally civilized, but inhabited by different and apparently older races. The barbarians of that age were the Picts, who lived on islands far out on the Western Ocean, the Atlanteans, who dwelt on a small continent between the Pictish Islands and the main or Thurian continent, and the Lemurians, who inhabited a chain of large islands in the Eastern Hemisphere. Okay, so in those 2 paragraphs, Howard has set down some hard and fast rules of geography, civilization, culture, and so on. And these things shall not be violated. Right? That is the fact of the matter. so to speak. And so, like J.R.R. Tolkien, puts these rules down as a personal reference, but also as a referential document. Because here's the thing. Robert E. Howard did not create everything he uses in his stories, if you can believe it. Atlantis, just as one example, but also the fact that he and several other authors at the time were known as the Lovecraftian Writers Circle. I think I'm saying that correctly, because he was a correspondent and friend with H.P. Lovecraft. And Lovecraft promoted the idea of other authors taking his ideas and working them into their own stories and vice versa. And there is a lot of Lovecraft in Howard's works. But when he started introducing these creatures and these gods and things into them, he also maintained a consistency with where they belonged in the pantheon, how they operated, and more specifically, who worshipped them. So even though he was borrowing ideas and concepts from others, with their permission, by the way, he was making sure that it all fit within the structure of his own rules and world. Okay? So when I titled this stream Foundation and Legacy, what I meant by that was there's two aspects to world building as far as I'm concerned. And by the way, I'm no scholar on this. I am sure this has been said to death by people who are far more knowledgeable about than I am about literature and so on. This is just me, layman terms, interpreting what I've seen and how I've looked at things over the years when it comes to these worlds and these settings. So, Foundation, Robert E. Howard's essay here describing the entirety, or at least the spirit of, the world in which his characters and his adventures take place. Then there's Legacy. Legacy is where you take something that was established and you build off of it while staying true to the rules and the settings and the characters and so on that were established previously. And the grandest example that I know of, prior to Disney's meddling back in 2014, 2015, or whenever, 2012, whenever they bought Star Wars, is the Star Wars Expanded Universe. Highlighted most particularly by sort of the foundational documents, so to speak, of the Expanded Universe, and that is the Timothy Zahn Heir to the Empire trilogy, Thrawn trilogy, whatever you want to call it, where Timothy Zahn took the foundation, that was the 3 Star Wars films and a few little bits and pieces in between, and then built on that in a logical, sort of thermodynamic way, that these are the rules established, and now we're going to move forward without violating those rules. And this is where you start building an environment where people can, who are fans of the source material, as in the first 3 films, can logically see the extension of those stories in these books in particular. And then the dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of novels and comic books and video games that grew out of these 3 books, either literally or by example. This is something that was so heartbreaking to me when Disney decided to say that all of this stuff, all of the expanded universe, was now legends, it didn't count anymore, etc. Because these books and the books beyond them, the video games, the comic books, they created a common language for Star Wars fans, built up brick by brick over 30 some odd years, and now you're just saying, it doesn't matter. Right? There was something very special in being able to reference something from this expanded universe with a fellow fan, speak contemporaneously about what was going on in the universe, right? And have an answer to a question as to why this happened versus that. Who is this character? What is their backstory? Because it was established, it was built on staying within the confines of what was given previously, right? And that's something that Hollywood lately doesn't care about or doesn't think about when they're making their movies. Example in point, the DC Expanded Universe. Now, you would think with as many examples before them, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's Conan, whether it's J.R.R. Tolkien, or whether it's the Marvel method in the MCU of having a plan, putting some rails on where you can and can't go with certain characters or how characters are supposed to operate versus others. You know, like Superman. Let's have a Superman that will put thousands of people under threat. Let's have a Superman that would rather let people die rather than reveal his secret. Does that sound like Superman? No. Is it a very simplistic example compared to the, gigantic expanse that is, say, Middle Earth or the Hyborian Age or something? Sure. But when the entire universe is centered around a particular character and their behavior patterns, their attitude, their beliefs, their powers, and so on, you have to abide by the rules of the road, or you're just not. You're making something completely different, right? It'd be as if Batman is running around Gotham City talking seriously about having to deal with muggles. Okay, you'd be like, wait, what? No, what kind of crossover is this? And having a crossover or a planned crossover or some kind of Elseworlds thing is fine, as long as everybody knows it's an Elseworlds thing. It's a diversion from fact. That's why I loved the What If series from Marvel Comics. This is my favorite issue, by the way, of the What If series from Marvel Comics. I have a lot of favorite issues, but this is the top one because, for several reasons, but specifically because of the ending. It doesn't give you a happy ending. Actually, a very terrifying ending. I won't tell you what it is, but it's great. This is what I loved about What If, because these were planned divergences from established fact. If you saw the title, What If Doom Became Sorcerer Supreme? What does that mean to someone who has no idea about Doctor Doom or the Sorcerer Supreme? Probably nothing, right? But to a nerd like me, right, who comes into this already knowing quite a lot about Doctor Doom, also knowing quite a lot about what the Sorcerer Supreme is and how you become Sorcerer Supreme. When I saw that title as a kid, my imagination ran wild because I knew the rules of the road. I also knew what rules would have to be broken or shifted to reach this outcome. And there's something about that you cannot manufacture. In having the foreknowledge of a universe or a setting or a series of characters, and then being suggested with the idea that you're going to be presented with a story where all those rules are broken. So even before I opened the comic book, I was trying to think, how could this have happened? Knowing what I know about the true history of these characters. You can't buy that kind of excitement. But that excitement only comes from having an established world that is relatively consistent. Now, obviously, comic books, things shift, people change a little bit. They have to update this, the look of that, the artist does this instead of that last artist, and so on. But at least classically, not always the case these days, but at least classically, there was always an eye towards maintaining a consistency of the world. There was, and there's probably still is, but I noticed it much more in the past than I have in recent years. There was a tradition, at least at Marvel Comics, perhaps at other places, that when a new artist took over for an established artist on a series, they would spend the first issue or two of their run on the property by trying to emulate as best as they could the art style of the previous artist. I saw this most specifically when Mark Badgley, or Bagley, I don't know how to pronounce it, whichever I'm going for. Mark Badgley, I'll say, took over for Eric Larson in the Amazing Spider-Man comics. Eric Larson had a run on Amazing Spider-Man for several years, and it was one of my favorite runs of the character, just in the writing and the artwork. His artwork got a little crazy near the end. I think there was some short-timer syndrome going there. But otherwise, when Mark Badgley took over for Eric Larson, I remember, because I collecting comic books for as long as I did, I started gaining an eye to recognize particular artists' styles when I saw them without having to look at the credits in the comic book. And I didn't keep up with who was writing or doing the art of a comic book at any particular time. I just remember I picked up this next issue of Amazing Spider-Man, and I noticed that the artwork was a little off. The lines were a little cleaner than the previous one, but it still looked like Eric Larson. So for that first issue or so, I thought, did Eric Larson like change up a little bit or something? But it was obvious to me. And then, by the time I got to the end of the comic book, I thought to myself, something's not right here. And this is before the internet where I could have looked up, or there was any like trade magazine that would tell me, the artist is changing over. I didn't have that information, but I could see that this was somebody different. Oh, this is bad. Who the heck is Mark Badgley? And then as the issues progressed, Mark Badgley's personal style overtook. But there was a transitionary period. And if you look back to the very first issue of Spider-Man that Eric Larson did, as far as I can recall, he was very much attempting to emulate the artwork of John Romita Jr. So there was this tradition of having a consistency, of giving respect to what came before, and understanding that you're taking over for someone else's legacy, but you're going to be building upon it. Right? That's the part that was always so neat about comic books, and what always felt neat about people taking on the setting of a previously established set of characters. And that's why something like this, what if Doom became Sorcerer Supreme? Well, I don't know. What if he did? Well, what would happen? That excitement only comes from having some pre-established idea of how things are supposed to be. And again, that creates a shared language amongst fans, so they too can know, hey, what would have to happen for this eventuality to take place? Another example that I want to put out there, that's maybe a bit more esoteric to some of you than others, is Warhammer 40,000 specifically. There's also Warhammer fantasy role-playing, but Warhammer 40,000 in particular. You want to talk about a long timeline of complex events, factions, personalities, rules of the road, magic, science, the decay of science, on and on and on. You can't get much more epic, much more grandiose than Warhammer 40,000. And if you talk to Warhammer 40,000 fans, real fans, about what their favorite aspect is of the setting, who their favorite chapter is amongst the Space Marines, or whatever, chapter and verse, no pun intended, will be relayed to you, because this stuff is serious business to people, and I understand why. I understand as a fan of other properties, right? Like when I watch things like Star Trek Discovery or the first two seasons, knock wood on season 3 of Star Trek Picard, and I see the degradation of such gloried franchises as Star Trek or Doctor Who, even though I'm not a super duper Doctor Who fan or a super duper Star Trek fan, although I'm probably a little bit more knowledgeable than the average bear, I still feel bad for my fellow nerds of franchises that they love, because they've been put in the hands of people that don't care. And this is why I'm so excited, both directly and by proxy, for Warhammer fans right now, because, just as an example, a fingers crossed example of what you would hope would happen, Warhammer as a franchise has been mostly relegated to tabletop role-playing, miniatures, elsewise, a few short animated deals, novels for sure, and video games. But there's never been like a full-length Warhammer movie. There's never been a full-length Warhammer 40K TV series. But now they're planning on doing the latter on Amazon, which is also a red flag. But the spark of hope, is that it is being headed up and showcased and flagshipped, let's say, by Henry Cavill. Going back to Superman for a second, Henry Cavill is a lifelong, die-hard Warhammer 40K fan, and if he is in charge of setting the course for that TV show, he'll be taking on the legacy of a very long and storied foundationary universe. And I'm very much looking forward to that. But he's already a pre-established fan. He already respects the world in which things are operating in. You can't say the same about the people in charge of certain properties in Hollywood right now. The most stark example I can give about that is WandaVision. Okay. Now, somebody coming in to the characters of Scarlet Witch and the Vision and their children and having absolutely no idea about any of that can be forgiven for not noticing something was a bit amiss in WandaVision, aside from some of the writing and some of the acting and some of the storytelling. But specifically, there was something amiss. There's something left out. It would take me hours to go over the epic that is Wanda, Vision, and her children. But suffice it to say, there's a character that was integral to the original stories in regards to how a witch and an android could end up having mortal children. And one of those major elements is a character called Mephisto. Okay, now Mephisto, for those of you that don't know, is effectively kind of the representation of the devil in the Marvel universe. Okay, for just to make it simple, because there's a lot more behind it, but just for simplification's sake, he's the devil. And he had a major hand in the events that took place to put Wanda and Vision in charge of two children. Now, if you are coming into the job of having to adapt the story of Wanda, Vision, and their children into a TV show, what would you think you would need to do? What would be expected of you? What would you expect of yourself? Well, you would think that you would read the source material to get some ideas. And even if you're not the writer of the show, if you're at least the director or the showrunner or something, you'd have some idea just so you can sort of keep an eye on things and know what you're talking about. Now, that didn't take place in WandaVision because the showrunner, Jack Schaefer, she came out after the fact, and said she had no idea who Mephisto was until after wrapping production. Now, that irked me beyond words, because here's the thing. If you decide not to use Mephisto in the story of Wanda, the Vision, and, her children, okay, that's not necessarily the greatest sin ever. There might be reasons why. There might be a whole raft of issues with trying to bring that character and their importance to the show, let alone the MCU, into fruition. Okay. But to not even know who the character was, that tells me something more. That tells me you have absolutely no knowledge of or love for the Marvel universe in general. To not know who Mephisto is by name, what even the barest significance of that character in the Marvel universe proper, it tells me you have no care at all for what you're working with or the sandbox you're playing in. You didn't read any of the foundationary documents of even what it is you're working with. And that is both depressing and infuriating and, just defeating. That's why I'm so happy for Warhammer 40K fans that at least we'll see what the final product will be, but at least they know they have an advocate in bringing their fandom to life in Henry Cavill. It is such a frustrating experience over and over again to see articles come out about productions like The Last of Us or WandaVision or Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where you read, or like Cowboy Bebop, where you read about how the people running the show or the actors involved either were told to avoid consuming anything about the source material or pointedly ignored the source material in creating their productions. What's the point? What's the point? Why create something that is supposed to be an extension of an established language amongst the very audience you would hope would be paying for your product, and just say it doesn't matter? It's irrelevant. You know what that tells people? And I know this should be simple logic. You know what that tells people who are fans of the property that you are intending to bring to life or to turn into a new product? It tells them that they don't matter. It tells them that this is not for you. The very people who made this thing so popular in the first place that we now have jobs trying to bring this thing to life in a production. It is so bass-ackwards in thinking and respect. I often don't know what to say when I see those things, except, well, I guess that's just the Hollywood scheme now. Thank you. This is Kyle. From what I've heard, a lot of studios purposely hire people that don't know the source material. Yeah, exactly. It's true. They purposefully. I mean, there was a statement, I think, out of either Disney or DC or something, or Warner Brothers, I should say, in recent months, where someone leaked that very opinion or stated that very explicitly. Why? Well, we don't want to be tramped down. We don't want to be constrained by this, that, other. The constraints are what make the thing a thing. The constraints are what make the Hyborian Age the Hyborian Age. The constraints are what make Hogwarts Hogwarts. The constraints were what made the Star Wars universe the Star Wars universe, and not someone else's universe, not the Dune universe, the Star Wars universe. Oh, they both take place in space. Oh, well, obviously, they're obviously exactly the same. Well, we both have an emperor, so there's not really that much difference, guys. Try putting two Star Wars nerds in front of two Dune nerds and tell them that their universes are exactly the same. Thank you, Memes of Destruction. When in doubt, Carbonadium Sword. Let's not forget Deadpool Merkin, Deadpool Merkin, Marvel Universe is canon. Merson? Well, let's not forget that the Punisher kills the Marvel Universe was a big what if. Yeah, canon. What does canon mean? Right? Now, if you want an example of canon, like I say, go back to the Robert E. Howard essay on the Hyborian Age. That's what canon is. That is the foundationary document of that entire world and all those stories. He always referred back to that and thinking about, okay, I'm going to have Conan end up in this country with this culture taking place, worshiping this god with these circumstances, in this geography, in this biome. Now that I don't need to think about all those things or make them up offhand because I've already established them, how does Conan interact with these established facts? You save yourself a whole lot of time and effort as a writer if you don't need to think too hard about what's going to be affecting your characters if you already know what's going to be affecting your characters. Now, one last example before I wrap up, because I'm not meaning to go on too long. But there is something to be said about leaving room to maneuver for your audience. And that's things like role-playing games. That's things like leaving myths and uncertainties in the setting itself. Vampire the Masquerade was something that I have far too much experience with. A setting that effectively asks, what if vampires actually existed in the real world? Where did they come from? How do they operate? And so on. Within the constraints of both the real world as a sort of glorified antagonist, but also within the constraints of the rules set down about what they can or cannot do, and what else is sort of left to the imagination of the reader or the player, as it were. Thank you again. This is Kyle. I've heard the argument that the restraints hinder creativity. I'd argue the restraints should inspire creativity. If you can't be creative with restraints, then you weren't very creative to begin with. Here's the thing, and you hear this all the time. This is not anything new. Think about a real world issue where someone has a physical disability. Okay? It doesn't matter, whatever it is. Someone has a physical disability, which they didn't have before, but they want to be able to do some of the same things they were able to do previously, or some semblance of them, depending on the circumstances. What do you do then? You say, okay, well, life has given me these constraints. And in fact, this goes for anything, physical disability, economic impairment, whatever you want to call it, right? I have these constraints on my life. I want to do XYZ PDQ. what can I do within these constraints to still get stuff done? Necessity is the mother of invention. If you're not allowed to use the force to create life out of whole cloth in front of you, right? Or just say, if you're not allowed to use magic to create money in front of you, then Doctor Strange has to get a job. That's really it. That's where the story comes from. If you jump up against an obstacle that is impassable, well, what do you do to try to at least solve the problem or work within the constraint? You're exactly right. If you take all the blocks off, if you unchain everything, then there's no interesting things going on. Everything can be resolved with the snap of the fingers. That's why the constraints are there. That's what allows you to move within them and also build off of them, right? One man's constraint can be another man's stepping stone for creativity, depending on how you look at it. So, going back to Vampire the Masquerade for a second, the origins of the vampires, their eventual fates, the danger that is looming over them outside of just mankind finding out their existence. In Vampire the Masquerade, there was one original vampire, Cain, as in Cain and Abel, although spelled with an E in this deal, because why not? And Cain was cursed by God to wander the earth and drink only of the blood of other people and never have the sustenance of the food of the earth that he once farmed and so on. And Cain was able to make children, and he created, 5 or 6, depending on how you look at it, companions that also shared his curse when he passed it on to them. He embraced them, and they shared his curse. And then they as well created children of their own, 12 or 13, depending on how you look at it, who then beget others. But then they tried to rebel against their masters, and they were cursed again by God or by Cain, depending. Now, I say depending because there are some rules set down. There's some general acceptable facts about the origins of vampires, but there's a lot of left to myth and legend and otherwise. So you can still build your own stories. You can still work within the confines of the rules, but in the spirit of what's set down. Right? Anyway, these 12 or 13 vampires, for having rebelled against and killed their creators, are cursed for the rest of their lives, eternities, and all that might come about from their bloodlines. All carry a particular curse based on their personalities. So you have vampires who can only drink blood from certain vessels, let's say. You have vampires who are permanently insane. You have vampires who are permanently angry, on and on and on. And each one of these bloodlines turns into clans, turns into a philosophy of existing as a vampire, and on and on and on. And yet there's still things left unsaid or unspecified, that someone can come along and tell their own story within the spirit and the setting of what's been established. There are some hard and fast rules. Fire causes death. Sunlight causes death. There are plenty of other vampire stories where sunlight doesn't cause death. Sunlight just makes a vampire weak, feels sick. Right? It was, I forget who it was. I think it was either John Landis or something. And he was asking somebody, like, how do you kill a vampire? And somebody says, stake to the heart. And he says, no, you kill a vampire however you want because vampires don't exist. That's true. But if you're working within a specific setting, there are rules. And sticking to those rules creates a common language, a common understanding amongst fans that are interchangeable and familiar. And it creates a community. And it creates almost a kind of brotherhood. Right? Because again, when I see Doctor Who being turned into an absolute joke of its former glory, I feel bad for Doctor Who fans, even Doctor Who fans who I don't know, who might not share any of my interests, but I know what that feels like. It generates a sense of empathy, of being able to say, I know this world. It is a part of my life, right? It's something that I share with other people, and I'm excited to do so because I find it so interesting. And when you rip that away, when you say the rules don't matter, when you say, I know better than you about how to do this, when you say, your setting is offensive and I'm going to fix it, you don't care. You're not a fan. I don't feel any kinship with you. And whatever you're producing is not something I'm willing to put money down for. That's something that Hollywood seemingly can't learn. Maybe they're starting to. Maybe the numbers returning lately are starting to tell them something. Maybe actually listening to the fans might teach them something about supply and demand. I don't know. I guess time will tell. But all of this is just to say, when you're thinking about doing a story or creating a world or whatever else, really stop first before telling the story. Think about the world you want to work within. Or if you're going to do fan fiction or attempt to do some kind of work off of an established world or something, really read what are the rules of that world, right? And like this is Kyle intimated, the restrictions of the setting you're working within or that you set for yourself will force you by imagination to either work within or perhaps, if you find a way that makes sense to the world, overcome them. Or if they are overcome, it is an epic event for anybody who's a fan of that world because they'll know what it means to have overcome that obstacle. How did Doctor Doom become the Sorcerer Supreme? Right? What rules of the universe had to be broken or bent? What different pathways in life had to be taken to achieve that outcome? All of that was going through my brain when I saw that cover because I already knew the world and the world was being broken in front of me, and that meant something. And it means something in one way when it's done as part of a what if. It means something completely different when somebody comes up and says, hey, I'm going to make a movie or a TV show based on your favorite thing. Well, unless you put a what if in front of it, you better stick to the rules, or else what you're making is not what you say you're making. Okay, so there's my rant, my dissertation, whatever you want to call it, on world building and the importance of it. I don't know how effective it was, but you'll have to tell me. Let's see. Rambler, it's funny because I believe the same for D&D 5e. You guys talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, they keep changing the editions and going back against old rules and like, oh, well, we can't call orcs an evil race now because obviously orcs resemble blah, blah, according to racists. Can you imagine racists are running D&D now? It's... It really is something else. Dr. Funkenstein, technically, Bruja got double curses. The Truha lacked emotions. The Bruja feel all emotions. Yes, I know. The true Bruja are different. But they also have Temporis, which completely breaks... Man, Temporis. Especially in live action. When they put out a supplement for the Laws of the Night, the live action, the official live action Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game, and they put in a rules for Temporis. I remember I was playing in a game of this, and somebody had Temporis, and one of the powers was called, I think it was called recursion or something. Basically, it's like you spend a blood point, and whoever your target is, they are stuck in a time loop for a few seconds, and they can't get out of it. Whatever they were doing, they will just continually repeat. And this player in the game, absolute genius, he was being attacked by a guy with a shotgun, right? And so the guy with the shotgun racks the gun, getting ready to fire. But then this genius uses recursion on him at that moment, and the guy just continually racks the gun over and over again, ejecting shells until the gun's empty. And so all these Dragon's Breath rounds are lying on the ground, and by the time the power is over with, the guy's standing there with an empty shotgun, having no idea what just happened, but completely vulnerable. Great use of the power. Cracked and broken as hell, though. Shadow Call, look to Spider-Man. So many people like him because he had to juggle a job of being a hero and relationships. If he loses a job, he can't get materials for his equipment. Exactly. Excellent example. Excellent example. Spider-Man was constrained by his economy, right? He was constrained by his economy. Without selling photos to the Daily Bugle, he couldn't be Spider-Man. And so what happens if the Daily Bugle closes, right? Or his camera equipment gets broken or something. Exactly. And what happens as a result of those complications? That's called story. That's called character development. Exactly. Right? It's a perfect example. Let's see. Anything else? Rand American, restraint is how you get stronger. Ask any weightlifter. Right. There are certain laws of thermodynamics in both life and in storytelling that you need to abide by. And rules and restrictions help with story. They don't hinder it. And so all these Hollywood guys and everything else saying, oh, well, we don't want to lean too heavily into the original material because that just constrains it. No. Exact opposite. Exact opposite. What happens on a movie set? Like, we need to get this effect. We need to have this effect. Like the book says, the effect when someone uses this power is X. But we're on a limited budget. How do we make that happen anyway? Imagine what gold that is to an effects specialist who has to come up with a way to visually represent a magical effect or whatever without CGI or something, or maybe with CGI but a limited budget, and still make it look good. Those constraints, it's a quote from an episode of MacGyver, but pressure turns coal into diamonds, right? Of course, the MacGyver retorts with, it can also crush it to dust, because he's talking to an overbearing father. But anyway, and it resulted in a high school, college level nuclear bomb. But that's a whole other storyline. Don't worry about that one. Amy Minty, in my opinion, the reason Spider-Man Peter Parker was so popular was the Charlie Brown effect. A good guy who drew the short straw in life but rises to the challenge. Yeah. It was a power fantasy. It was something everybody could relate to. More people could relate to than otherwise. Being picked on, being the person who's the underdog, not having all the advantages in the world, but also, again, being bestowed with this amazing power, and yet the Uncle Ben effect, having a very, very overpowering sense of responsibility, having seen the consequences of not being responsible, right? Having that hanging over your head the rest of your life, that kind of guilt. Yeah, now that's character building. That's storytelling. If you take away the moral imperative of Peter Parker, what do you have? Is it even Spider-Man anymore? If Zack Snyder got a hold of Spider-Man and decided the whole Uncle Ben thing was too restricting in how he wanted to tell his story, would that still be Spider-Man? I don't think so. I think there are certain elements to certain characters and worlds that are necessity, that are sacrosanct. That if you get rid of those things, ignore those things, or at least not account for those things, you're no longer operating with that character or with that world. Memes of Destruction, +5 for the MacGyver reference. Yeah, I forget what it was, but it was this episode where all these kids in a college were challenged in some kind of science class or some kind of creative arts mechanics class or something to lock the doors of their dorm rooms. But they had to do with some creative way, right? Some mechanism, something or other else that somebody else had to try to defeat. And the whole story was behind this professor whose own son was at the college, and his son was always trying to impress his dad because his dad was very overbearing and very, very exacting on his son. And his son came up with a brilliant way to lock his door without anybody finding out, except that somebody cheated and he got defeated, and his father got all on him over it. And so his son went nuts and decided to prove his father wrong about his ability to do whatever. And he built a nuclear bomb out of everyday household items at the college. And then it becomes this whole countdown thing. And oh man, remember when TV was good and interesting? Remember when individual episodes were individual episodes and TV series weren't meant to be and built as one long continuous story arc, that you had to tell a full story inside of 45 minutes or half hour, and it had to be complete. and it's still so memorable that it's stuck in my brain 30 years after the fact, or 40 years or whatever the hell it is now. Those were the days. Now I watch TV series, I binge them or whatever on Amazon Prime or Netflix or whatever, and I'm lucky if I can remember certain characters' names 20 minutes after I've watched an episode. It's depressing. It can be. And lastly, before I wrap things up, Rambler, D&D and World of Darkness were the ultimate power fantasy. You came from Rat Slayers to the Warriors of Light and told your story of how you did that through play. The current editions are the stories. Okay, now I have to binge Rambler's comments. Okay, well, the stories, how the heroes become legends. Yeah, you build up. I mean, that was always the best part for me in the role-playing games I played, is starting out with nothing, being at the lowest end of things, and working my way up to something else, having to solve that problem. How do I solve the problem of being in the position I'm at? I'm a vampire who has no home, who is living out of a van, which I'm parking at the bottom of a parking garage every day, because having all that concrete above me in the sun is probably the safest place I'm going to be. But I don't like living inside of a curtained over van in the bottom of a parking lot every day. I'd rather have my own place. How do I solve for that problem? It's the building up. It's the finding out, right? That's what makes it interesting. That's where the stories come from. How do I go from living in a van to living in, I don't know, an apartment maybe? But do I want to live in an apartment? Is there an escape hatch for me in that apartment? Can the sunlight be blocked safely in that apartment? Do I want to be in the basement? Is there somewhere else I can be? Because sunlight will kill me. That is something I can't do anything about. Sunlight will kill me. I have no way around that. That is a hard and fast obstacle to my existence. How do I solve it? Again, storytelling. Simple rule, but just one example of what you can do when you set boundaries and set rules for the world you're working in. Anyway, I could go on, but I think I've said my piece. Please let me know, both in chat now, if you're able to, or in the comments later, or, and let me do this now before I forget, I'll put it in chat. Or you can now join, if you haven't already, my Discord server. So let me get this here. So I'm going to put this into the chat. This is a link good for 1 day. If you're not already part of the Discord server, and you'd like to come on and hang out, discuss things, or whatever, by all means, join up. The secret word, the password, in case I don't recognize you offhand by your nickname, the secret word password for today is Hyboria. 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 If you go into the chat there and say Hyboria, someone, either myself or someone else, will activate your access to the rest of the server. Your nickname will turn from white to aquamarine, and you'll become an official Lunarian of the Scribelite Discord server. There you go, guys. Again, let me know what you think about this in the comments below. Any other examples you've come across, any worlds or settings or something you'd like to promote, by all means, put it in there as well. And of course, go on the Discord server. You can talk about that. Let's see, programming note. Next Thursday, as always, will be the next episode of TED Excellence at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, where it'll be the last episode of Superpowers Month. I've got a couple of options for which one I'm going to go for. I now have the wherewithal to try to avoid something that is too good for its own good, because if I watch it too long without commenting, YouTube's going to zap me. But elsewise, that'll be next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. And of course, next Sunday, as always, 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern for the Sunday stream. And I might also do streams in between. Who knows what events may cause me to think about or want to talk about or transpire otherwise. But with that, everyone, thank you guys so much for joining me for this. I really do appreciate your attendance and your participation. Moderators, thank you for keeping an eye on things. Even though everyone here is so well behaved, you have very, very little to do. Everybody who donated, either to myself or to the fundraisers pinned to the top of the chat box, thank you so much for your generosity. It is really appreciated. Hope you all are having a good Sunday. If you have tomorrow off for President's Day, good on ye. If you don't, I hope your workday tomorrow is not too stressful. And I hope you are all safe and well. If you're not well, please get well soon. And I'll see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.